Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what artistic research is, but I'm not going to talk specifically about the current debates that have been raging quite violently in university administrations, both in America and in the United Kingdom, and now more and more across Europe, about whether or not artistic practice should be conceived of as research within a university system. This is something that has dominated my life, it feels like, for 10 years. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm really happy to get involved in that debate if it's important and useful for you when we talk at the end of this. But however, I really hope that some of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of structures and infrastructures of inequality and their production through contemporary art and contemporary art education will be useful as a kind of broader framework for those debates. But before I begin, I'd really like to know who's here. I mean, because I'm going to talk mainly from the perspective of contemporary art, but I'm aware that this is a transdisciplinary territory. I work, as Doreen says, with many, many people from different disciplines, not only in the humanities, but across the sciences and the social sciences. So but I am talking from a contemporary art perspective. Is that really okay with everybody? Are most people involved in the production and distribution of contemporary art here? Yeah? Okay, good. So I don't have to worry that I'm...
What if not?
Huh?
What if not? Or like...
Well, no, I'm just wondering if there are people that, if I talk about contemporary curating, for instance, then I might be making assumptions that people understand what contemporary curating is. And I wouldn't want to do that if there were people that were much more involved in distribution of design through production, through economic production, or if they were involved in mapping, spaces in architectural spaces in China and didn't. Do you see what I mean? So but I think we're fine. I think it'll be all right. Okay. But so the other thing is, the bad news for you tonight is that my flight was delayed by 2 hours this morning in London, so I had time to do more work on the paper. And when I do more work on a talk, it means it gets more and more like knotted up and intense, and as I try and make things more and more complicated for myself, because this very much is, as Doreen suggested, a work in progress and a chunk of a bigger project that I'm working on at the moment, which will eventually be a book. And so that's bad, because it means that I've been able to tangle up the ideas more and more. So you must tell me if, because I'm also speaking in English, if I'm going too fast or if I'm saying things that need to be unpacked. So shout. So in this talk I want to bring together the critical framework I'm developing in my current research regarding the underlying power structures of contemporary art production and distribution, and what I call the privatisation of artistic research. This is not only important for me as an arts professional and academic, currently paid to encourage artistic research by the state of Sweden, which is where my current professorial post is, but also due to the fact that I have been invited to Geneva by Doreen to talk with students and staff of a developing MA and PhD program at the University of Art and Design. So those are the contexts into which these thoughts need to be placed. So a big context and a specific local context, which I guess we will develop more tomorrow when we talk more specifically about what you're doing here. Like in most European states, in Switzerland there is concern and argument over the status of artistic research within both the academy and the professional art world. There's usually distrust on both sides, except for within honorary examples. But there are less good examples than there are bad. But rather than go into the details of this, or to begin to identify the underlying structural problems of art and its educational structures in relationship to the production of privatisation and thus production of it. Sorry, rather than going into the details of that, what I want to do is look at the underlying structural problems of art and its educational structures in relationship to the production and privatisation of inequality. I'll talk about what I mean by inequality in a bit. What I want to draw attention to, therefore, and in the context of this research series that I've been invited to attend, Navigating Turbulences, is how contemporary artistic and curatorial production navigates the things that have been named as turbulences by Doreen and the people that put the programme together. My idea, my hunch, my thought is that actually, even though we think we navigate turbulences very well, in fact, we do it very badly. This is not to say that there are not many committed, activist, action-inspired artists and curators in the field of Western production who do not recognise and attempt to draw attention to contemporary forms of inequality, racism, homophobia, misogyny, ideologically produced statecraft, etc., etc. It's not because there aren't many people like that who we work with, who we feel we are, who are in this room. I recognise us as that. It is to say that the structures of our production, from the small-scale startup to the Biennale and globally franchised touring exhibition, are endemically formed through privatisation and thus endemically structured to create the forms of inequality that we desire to align ourselves, hopefully collaboratively, against. So what I'm saying there is that I'm trying initially to name a problem, to describe a problem, and the problem is that within the sphere of artistic production and distribution, which is one way of saying what artists do, what curators do, what directors of galleries do, what dealers do, what art markets do, all of that. There are many, many people who are making projects, who are developing gestures, who are producing images, moving images, still images, who are making objects that are deliberately designed to be antagonistic towards the productions of inequality that they find around them. I'm being very abstract in my language here, obviously, but you can walk into any gallery around the world right now, well, not around the world, obviously, in the West right now, and you will find critical art, critical curatorial projects, yeah? But what I'm saying is that that work exists within a structure, an infrastructure, that before the work has even hit the floor, before the work has even hit the walls, to be very traditional about where work might go, there is already a problem, and the problem is that the motivational, the psychic, the psychological, the infrastructural, the managerial, and the value-based forms that produce the work and the subject that makes the work in the first place are produced through inequality. So we have this deep contradiction at the base, at the core of artistic production, or what we currently understand as artistic production in the West. Of course, in other spheres of the world, and at different points historically in the world, the concept of artistic production has not been like this. It's been different. It's been not named. It has not been done by artists. It might have been done in a much more dispersed way. But in our current scenario, in our current scenography, it's almost impossible to escape the rendition, the rendering of the artist as the primary focus of the modes through which this stuff we call art is produced, and through which we produce forms of, as I've said, psychic and infrastructural inequality. So this is what I'm naming as the problem. I emphasize emphasize that privatisation here is not simply a mechanism of financialisation. We normally think, well, I normally think, if I'm using the term privatisation in a kind of everyday sense, I normally equate it with money. So I normally equate privatisation with things like the privatisation of the banks, or the privatisation of state-run industries, or the privatisation of a home or a house. I am meaning that, but I'm also meaning, through privatisation, a spatial, temporal and psychic mechanism. So privatisation isn't just the thing that is rendered through the withdrawal of money, or the giving of money, or the moving of money from one place to another. It's also done through the movement of bodies, the movement of peoples, the architectural and scenographic kind of scene organisation of peoples and places as well. This is specifically true of artistic education currently. I think always, ever since artistic education actually has evolved, it's a relatively the idea of artistic education is relatively new in the long tail of the development of universities, for example. So this is specifically true, this idea of privatisation of artistic education and the production of what we now call artistic research, or practice-based research is another term that is often used in its place. This is why I say, and I said in the blurb, in the little paragraph that I sent to Doreen to advertise this talk, this is why I say in that paragraph that what I'm trying to work out is why we do not and don't seem to be able to adequately address our own epistemological guarantees. Now, what do I mean by epistemological guarantees? So if an epistemology is a body of knowledge, then bodies of knowledge guarantee things. And within art, the guarantee is the production of an artifact or an object or an image as an end result of a research process. The research process nowadays might go beyond that image, it might go beyond that object, it might recur, it might be produced through a systematization of different structures and different mobilizations of materialities and bodies and performativities. So it might be much more amoebus-like than in previous times. A kind of post-conceptual understanding of what contemporary art might be, but nevertheless, it's still guaranteeing psychologically and structurally and economically a form of production that at least can be produced for a space of display. So this is the guarantee of art. When I talk about there being an epistemological guarantee, then this is the guarantee that art makes. And this guarantee is the thing that stops the ability of art and artists to go beyond the mechanisms or the infrastructures of production that support radical modes of redistribution, of redissemination. And the stopping is the thing that produces inequality. I know that sounds really complicated, and sometimes I don't know what I'm talking about. So, I think I know what I'm talking about. So I'll come back to this. But I want to start by describing my current research around contemporary art. And before I do, a few words about the image that was used in the blurb, because in a way it harks back to a different moment in a similar story that I'm telling. So there's a big one and a small one, and another one here. But you've all seen it. So this is a poster that was posted up all over London in the early 1990s, and it's by an artist called Stuart Home. People know Stuart Home? You know Stuart Home? Yeah. And Stuart, radical blogger now, but radical anarchic thinker and artist, spent a lot of time developing the infrastructure and then doing an art strike. And there have been many art strikes. I don't know whether there's a tradition of art strikes in Switzerland, but there's definitely a tradition of art strikes in the Nordic countries and in the UK and the USA. I don't know about Switzerland. Have there been art strikes here? Art strikes that have been going on since the middle of the 19th century. So it's quite an interesting history of art strikes. And art strikes are the moment in which the artist or artists stop making work, yeah, or refuse to put work on the market. And there's various different forms that art strikes have taken over the past almost 200 years. No, 175 years. But this art strike was a very very well publicised one, and Stuart Home had some important ideas about striking. But it was fairly simplistic, I have to say. It was fairly basic, and it was about catching the eye of the media. So the idea of no more beautiful pictures, obviously, is we to us now maybe, and even then, in between 90 and 93, the idea of an artist's role being to produce beautiful pictures was not something that was really supported by the contemporary art market or the contemporary distribution system in terms of contemporary art galleries, for instance. Maybe it is supported by certain museums, but nevertheless, beautiful pictures is still the kind of the media idea, a certain type of media idea of what artists are supposed to do. And so Stuart said at this point, and I'm quoting him now, and this is just from his website. He has a hugely packed website of every single thing he's ever done. Okay, so he's quite an interesting character. But he says on the website, the 1990 art strike was called as a means of encouraging critical debate around the concept of art. While certain individuals will put down their tools and cease to make, distribute, sell, exhibit, or discuss their cultural work for a 3-year period beginning on January the 1st, 1990, the numbers involved will be so small that the strike is unlikely to force the closure of any galleries or art institutions. It will, however, demonstrate that the socially imposed hierarchy of the arts can be aggressively challenged. And then he goes on to say, one of the purposes of the art strike is to draw attention to the process by which works of art are legitimated. Those artists and administrators who are in the privileged position of deciding what is and is not art constitute a specific faction of the ruling class. So there's a certain kind of rhetoric that he uses that comes from a very important left-wing and anarchist political tradition in Britain. He carries on, they promote art as a superior form of knowledge and simultaneously use it as a means of celebrating the objective superiority of their own way of life on the basis that they are committed to art. Appreciation of art is generally used as a mark of distinction, privilege, and taste. That's the end of Stuart Home. Now, of course, this kind of language belongs to a kind of agitational propaganda. It belongs to a certain type of political action. It belongs to a kind of class war, effectively, that has, to a certain extent, disappeared from the UK, not culturally, because there is still a huge amount of inequality produced through the class system in the UK and the rest of the world, but this kind of language is less formulated as such. Stuart Home might still say things like this, but people that still hold these beliefs wouldn't really talk in this language anymore. However, the thing that he admits to, even at the beginning of this strike, is the fact that it will be inefficient, that it won't work. He says, to repeat it, the numbers involved will be so small that the strike is unlikely to force the closure of any galleries or art institutions. Okay? Now, of course, that begs the question: if we are working in a social sphere in which art is producing elite formations of cultural knowledge and production, should we try and stop them? Should we try and close them down? Should we try and repurpose them? And I've written and talked quite a lot about repurposing art institutions in the past. But we wouldn't necessarily frame it in this way as an art strike. We would frame it in a different way, perhaps, or perhaps we would. But I wanted to kind of put this out as an image because I think that there's something that's been lost in a sense, despite the fact that most of Stuart Home's rhetoric completely winds me up. There is still, nevertheless, something lost within the kind of punkish demand for change that is no longer so evident within the contemporary art community. I think that we should maybe think about why that shift has happened over the past 20 years. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three things, and I'm going to talk about them in decreasing amounts of space. So the first one's the longest. I'm going to talk about value, meritocracy, and management. And these three terms are terms that I'm kind of organising my research around at the moment. Value, meritocracy, which I'll go into detail and explain a bit for those people that are not familiar with the term, and management. And the reason I'm interested in these three terms is A, because they're kind of macroeconomic and macro-social structures that aren't just applied within the art world, they're implied in other places as well. Okay, so in businesses we can talk about value, in governments we can talk about value, in procedures of globalization we can talk about value and meritocracy and management. So it's not specific. But also because I'm trying to draw structural affinities and connections between some of the processes that are used to organize and distribute and make art and other places and other locales of distribution and development. Because I think we can learn if we make affinities and connections by the mistakes that other people have made, as well as the progress, if one can call it that people have made. So the research begins with questions of value. What do artists, in the context of their inevitable participation in the processes of effective and financial value creation, do? This question has been asked many times before me, and the process of art's roles, specifically what has been termed public, socially engaged, relational, user, art, etc., often, but not always, are sponsored by Western states. These questions, these ideas of art's role, have been questioned, accumulated, and defied, albeit in contradictory modes, over 40, 50 years, so 5 decades. So I'm not the first person to say what do artists do when they find themselves stuck in this position of value creation and formation when the work that they're making is opposed to that. That's something that is now it's just a truism, yeah? Most artists that I work with suffer in this way. Okay. So, central to the debate that occurs, and therefore an important question for my research, is the claim that some forms of artistic practice eschew, so they get round their location within values capture through forms that destabilize value itself. So that's one claim that artists and curators and directors and theorists like me make about certain types of art, although I decreasingly feel able to do so. Broadly, there are two forms of artistic work that claim this. The first is work done in collaboration with communities, made by artists in discussions and practices of social, usually local participation. So the claim is often made for that kind of work that it doesn't contribute to overall value production within the arts. The second type is what I'm calling interventionist. Artworks that confront the problems of inequality, exclusive access, financial hierarchization, and lack of social support through aesthetic gestures within an already highly valued or becoming more valuable environment. And when I say becoming more valuable, I'm thinking here of the kind of the spread of art value out of Western territories into other territories, other global territories in the world, where there is an increasing interest in, for instance, locating a biennale in sub-Saharan Africa on the basis of the gentrification effect that has worked well within the UK or Australia or Switzerland, and therefore could possibly work well elsewhere. Of course, we know that artworks within a situation of sociality add value, literally, to territory, whether this is a local site-specific commission adding value to house prices and thus participating, as I've said, in gentrification, or a biennale being produced and used as a city branding mechanism. Again, I'm not the first person to have noticed that. But other forms of value are produced by the epistemology of value attached to contemporary art, and it's these that I'm much more interested in. Not that I'm saying the former type aren't a problem, I just think we need to dig a little bit deeper to understand how the first lot is produced. These involve the basic roots of artistic production, the making of something privately, the display of something as a revelation that comes from this privacy, the autonomy and separation of the figure of the artist. Even the most radically communal and collaborative practices carry a strain of this value creation. And I think if you look at an artist like Tanya Bruguera, for instance, who is currently really battling within this kind of contradictory role, one still sees a figure, and I don't know, are people familiar with Tanya Bruguera's work? Yeah? Then one still sees a figure who is really enmeshed within these contradictions. It's something that she would say herself. And the idea that she is producing at the moment, or has produced for a long time, and other people are really taking up now, including the Van Museum, of whom we have a representative in the room today, the concept of useful art is also kind of wrapped up in this problematic. And, you know, I'm talking about a bunch of highly intelligent people who are trying to work their way out of it, but are working in systems that reproduce it all the time. So what do we do about this? How does value creation relate to the production of inequality? This research that I'm doing focuses on how inequality is produced within the arts. By inequality, I mean two things, and this is very basic. Firstly, these are slightly dodgy definitions, so bear with me. These are kind of working definitions. So, you know, I only speak them amongst friends, okay? So, firstly, what I'm calling slightly problematically visible signs of inequality. The ways in which certain people can access art and others can't. These inequalities are often produced, as I've said before, through socialized racisms, classism, and gender distinctions, as well as territorial divisions. So that's the first and more evident form of the production of inequality within art. Yeah? Certain people can't access it. And certainly can't access its education or the ability to be educated in it and from it. But secondly, the slightly less conspicuous but entirely related form of inequality produced by structures of art's forms of exhibition and display. Here, value creation and the production of inequality work side by side. Crossing both of these inequalities is a question of artistic education. How has artistic education produced inequality, and what are the ways in which education could change in order to provide a different form of learning? And maybe that's something we can talk about later and tomorrow.
Could you say the second one again?
Yes.
Sorry.
I have to read it again. So, the second one, the less conspicuous but entirely related form of inequality, is produced by structures of art's form of exhibition and display. So this is a much more kind of ontological subject-object formulation. So again, it's based on a kind of psychological, social and structural relationship between the object and the thing that is the body that is mind. Here, value creation and production of inequality. So they both cross over, of course. They're both entirely related to each other. So one of the core claims that I'm trying to make is that nearly every theoretical and practical production of alternative, relational, socially engaged, dialogical, communitarian, collective form of artistic or mode of artistic and curatorial production that has happened over the past 50 years, just a small claim, have been completely inadequate. You know, who am I to say? There's obviously going to be one somewhere that isn't inadequate, but I haven't found it yet. Not because they're not, and I keep stressing this, and they're not produced by incredibly intelligent, very politically engaged and well-informed people or groups of people, but because of the structure, both the structure of learning and the structure of display and the structure of distribution is weighted against that process of political recognition. So it just produces this contradiction. The reason for this inadequacy is a profound misapprehension of the subject of the artist and the subject of the participant and or viewer, participant viewer. The misapprehension is produced by the misguided logic that the subject of the participant needs emancipation and the subject of the artist can provide that emancipation within the framework of the artistic regime. And those of you that read contemporary philosophy in and around art might recognise some of those terms as the terms that Jacques Rancière uses. Now, I do follow Rancière to a certain extent, but I'm critical of what I perceive to be his own subsumption, his own desire of the laws of visuality, conditioned upon a placement and a looking that produces what he calls heterogeneity. And I won't go into this because it's a complex argument I have with Jacques Rancière's writing, which is probably very boring to anybody else. Okay. So, but I am also kind of, he's helping me in a sense. He's a what would you call it? A critical friend. Not a friend. This is a condition of all artistic production as it circulates through contemporary systems of exhibition and display, and it is art education that produces the desire and addiction to such a structure, which is why we need to think really, really closely about what artistic and curatorial practice-based research might be and should be and could be. I hope by the end of this research I have described a different, not the end of this lecture, but the end of my research, I have described a different form of education, aesthetic production and subject relation. So those are the three things that I've got to do. I've got to rethink education, aesthetic production and subjective relations. So all of those. This description will most likely suggest, of course, that the figure of the artist must be dismantled and the spaces of education and artistic production must be completely repurposed. Otherwise, we just carry on like a you know what a gerbil, a mouse, like in a just going round in a what are they called? Hamster wheel. That's good, thank you. Okay, so that was the bit on values. So now I'm going to talk a bit about meritocracy. I'm realising that I'm talking a bit. So maybe I'll skip the bit on meritocracy. We can maybe talk about it tomorrow because I realise I've been talking quite a long time. I'll just sketch over it. The reason I'm interested in meritocracy is because I think that artistic education and artistic production. When I say artistic, I'm also including curatorial production in there. Tori and I are curators. So are other people in this room, Nick, Sally, other people here that I don't know. I'll tell you what meritocracy is, and then it'll probably be clear to you why it's important for me to go through it. But I'm not going to go into detail now because otherwise I'll be speaking too much. So meritocracy is the system through which certain people emerge as leaders and dominant voices through the accumulation of their merit. That's why it's meritocracy. It is a system of governing and leading that is premised on the idea that natural ability is the best way to measure and reward success. In a meritocratic system, you are rewarded for your ambition and natural ability, and hard work that backs up that natural ability. But you can't get there on hard work alone. Meritocracy is a system that naturalizes inequality. It suggests that there is no possibility to include people who are not born with ability or have had the privilege and position to acquire skills without educational, financial, or social support. You can see already by this description of meritocracy why I think that art schools are really kind of gatherers of meritocratic value. The two people I've been working with a lot through reading them to establish and help me think through meritocracy are first a Labour MP from the British Labour Party who wrote in 1953 an extraordinary book called The Rise of Meritocracy, which was a fiction that was set in the future. So it's set in 2053, and it was a dystopian vision. So it kind of belongs to the dystopian modernist kind of paradigm of fiction writing that envisaged a world wherein a world. But basically the UK, because it was based on what he knew about the UK or the United Kingdom at the time. But it was based, so that this dystopian vision of the future was based on the idea that only the people that had merit would rise to the surface, to the top, and they would rule the systems and structures and governments and businesses and factories at the time. There's a lot of talk in the book about factories, because in 1953 factories were still very present as a mode of employment within the UK. It was meant as a critique, but it was taken at face value by lots of people as a kind of political vision that was good. So I'm very influenced by him, and I'm also very influenced by Paul Gilroy, who's written a lot about meritocracy and young black British and American men. So I've also been reading a lot about race and meritocracy, and the ways in which the meritocratic is used as a system of educational purposing of young black men, particularly of course this is Paul Gilroy's interest, that's what his theoretical interest is. Are people familiar with Paul Gilroy's writing? No? So Paul Gilroy is a black British scholar who's written a lot about, first of all, about racism in the UK. He's a professor of cultural studies at the London School of Economics. But his famous books, I guess his most very, very influenced by Stuart Hall, who is another British Caribbean scholar who's just recently passed away. And Paul Gilroy, I guess, you might have to help me here, but There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack was one of his most famous early books. And then The Black Atlantic is another one which talked about the slave trade. And he's written many, many brilliant and very important books, particularly if one wants to try and understand race in the UK, which I have wanted to do and still want to do. And so Gilroy talks specifically about how the system of valuation of young black men, and of course he's writing about this, I mean, he first started writing about meritocracy about 4 years ago, but so just before, of course, the spate of killings, the most recent spate of killings of young black men and older black men actually has happened in America, and he talked about it also in terms of the ways in which black men are, or young black boys are shaped through a paradigm of business and marketing. And again, I don't have time to go into it, but he talks a lot about subjectification. So those are the two people that I was going to talk about in relationship to meritocracy. I won't do it because it's too complicated and I bore you all silly. But I think that the term merit and meritocracy, if I'm very basic about it, I would say that my experience of teaching in art schools has taught me a great deal about meritocratic systems. So, for instance, when I used to teach at the art school at Goldsmiths, which is a very famous art school for boring reasons to do with the production of a very famous group of not very interesting artists in the early 1990s, the same time that Stuart Home is doing this. This is why I find Stuart Home more interesting. So Tracy Emin and what's his name? Really famous one. Damien Hirst and Sarah Lucas. You know them. Okay, they're the ones that intelligent people should be embarrassed by. Anyway, they very famously, so this art school that produced this kind of artist, and they're still interested in producing that kind of artist, not unlike many other art schools in the United States and the UK, in the Anglo-Saxon world particularly, but I think also we could talk about the various atelier programs in the Netherlands, certain non-aligned postgraduate programs in Germany that are very famous, that are very competitive to get into, all interested in producing this model. To get onto these programs, you don't need to have academic. Qualifications. You don't need to have got your higher levels at school in cultural studies and art, etc., etc. You just need to produce a beautiful portfolio. You need to display your natural talent. Okay, so already in the system, in the art system, the display of natural talent is the thing that makes you rise to the surface. And if you think about the way that art education is currently structured at BA level, so at undergraduate level, sorry, I'm talking in English terms here, shout if you don't understand, at undergraduate level, so the first degree you do, is you are taught through studio crits, yeah? So there are various different modes of doing it, but your work is talked to. Your work is responded to. You don't justify your work, you don't contextualize your work. Your work is talked at as if it were on its own in the centre of a large museum or gallery space. So the whole thing is kind of wrapped into this production. Even though the people that are teaching it, people like me, I haven't done that for a long time, I have to say, but, I don't think I could bring myself to do it. But people, super intelligent artists trying to do things in a different way, working collectively, radical feminists, queer folk who are dealing with their own kind of, indigeneity. Lots of really interesting stuff. However, this is the structure, this is the system of art education. And it is the system that produces artistic research, which is what we need to fight against when we set up new PhD programs. So, I'll just go to the end. What I'll do is I'll read the last paragraph on Paul Gilroy. So, it might not make much sense, but... So, while the analysis Gilroy offers, which I've kind of sketched out to you, is specific to issues of race in the UK and the US, that's who he's writing about and that's who he wants to talk to and it's who he wants to persuade to do things differently, it offers a succinct account of neoliberalism's effect on arts provision, not least through the cultural industry's continued utilisation of diversity as a bargaining tool for sponsorship. But it is the embodiment of meritocracy, its literal incorporation within the bodies and souls of young people, concomitant alongside the erosion, the chipping away, the making less stable of what Gilroy names solidarity, that is of importance to me. And perhaps a clue to the forms we might develop to navigate turbulences ourselves. And in a way, despite its complete naivety, this is a call for solidarity. It might be completely stupid, nevertheless it is one. For within arts organisations, both of these operations, the embodiment of meritocracy and the erosion of forms of solidarity, are at work. As the rise of competitive exhibition cultures fueled by arts economic infrastructures comes to dominate the ways in which arts institutions operate, despite notable collaborations, it becomes more and more impossible to imagine an alternative. It is the privatisation of resistance that Gilroy names in his writing on meritocracy, the privatisation of resistance that I seek to reverse in this production of contemporary culture. So 2 paragraphs on management, my last buzzword, and then I'm finished. So finally a word on management. I've been writing about and thinking and learning about management now for about 5 years. More and more I realise that in order to make political differences in any organisation, in any infrastructure, one needs to become part of management and manage differently. That's, for me, the kind of logic of where we need to go. Okay? So that's why management's become, but I'm learning, and I've been a manager in various different ways, and artists and curators are managers in various different ways as well, but not at a big enough scale, I don't think. So, one of the core research questions I have been exploring over a number of years is the role of management. What Paul Gilroy calls, to quote him, the great managerial revolution that has been forced throughout the development of representative democracy in Europe since the Second World War. Excuse me. Excuse me. Thank you. So Paul Gilroy calls it the great managerial revolution. So in management theory, and I'm also very influenced by a guy called Stefano Hani, in management theory, there is an understanding that management has significantly changed since the Second World War. And that's partly, again, too complicated to go into in this time, because I've already taken too much, the relationship between management, private and state funding, kind of really complex formation. And certainly in the States and in the UK, that is very dominant, that consortium of management, privatisation or private funding and state funding is very much in operation within the higher education system, and increasingly the lower as in the below 18s education system. The arts and educational institutions that we inhabit are the product of this managerial revolution and its exponential expansion as part of neoliberalism. The writer that I've just mentioned, Stefano Hani, is particularly good here, as he recognises in his book State Work, written about a decade ago and really very precise, I think, he recognises in this book the ways in which institutions incorporate radical alterity of position into their mechanisms. For example, forming community boards to advise on ethnic exclusion. That's one example he uses. So that's the way in which a business or a state function might incorporate the radical alterity of a group or of a set of ideas into itself in order to defend itself against critique, but also in order to stabilize, or what Stefano Hani will call deracinate or remove critique from the function of that very thing that it incorporates. So that's what's interesting about management. It has this same hamster wheel problematic that I keep coming back to. Management is perhaps the last hidden force of political hegemony. Michel Foucault wrote also, not quite in terms of management, but he recognised this, and I also draw a lot on him. Management produces the privatisation of resistance that Gilroy describes. So a footnote on artistic research to end, and perhaps to contribute to discussions we will have tomorrow. Artistic research is often thought of as a place of liberation of the artist. But the liberation comes at the cost of the continued elite privatisation of cultural knowledge. If we want to navigate turbulence, which we should want to do, we need to recognise the turbulences that we create as artistic, and in my case, and Doreen's case, curatorial, as artistic or curatorial knowledge production, and therefore are problematic because they are tied within this very wheel that eradicates turbulence. Our role is to create turbulence at the level of management, to reverse formations of meritocracy and to produce formations of devaluation in order to recalibrate our institutions and our teaching practices. Thank you.